Hello, in this demonstration, I'll show you how to run a Spark notebook on Google's Dataproc. I'll show you how to create a Google Cloud Platform or GCP project, enable the APIs for Dataproc, establish credentials, create a cloud bucket, create a Dataproc cluster, and run a notebook on the cluster. As you imagine, there's quite a few steps involved. Happy that Google has written down the steps. You can go to their website and walk through their tutorial, which is what essentially I'm going to do here. Before you do that, I just point out that you can get a free Google Cloud Platform account. Initially, it's $300, which is quite a bit to get started. And just need your Google email or Gmail ID. So walk through those steps and get yourself an account, and then go through these steps if you want to run a notebook on Google Dataproc. There's a tutorial, and this is the tutorial I'm going through roughly. So let's get started. So first, the overview, and there's quite a few steps. First thing, you'll create a Google Cloud Platform project, essentially give it a name, and there's some limitations on the name. And I recommend that you don't take the default project ID, but instead you give your own project ID. And in general, for these kinds of projects, I think this is a good idea so that it's simpler than to reference the project later on with some ID that you give it rather than some random number. So look for there's a link about project ID when you create a project. Then once you've done that for this project that we're working on for Dataproc, then you want to enable the Cloud Proc API. And probably the easiest way to do these things in GCP is to look for the search box here at the top, and then just type in what you're going to search for, in this case, Cloud Dataproc, and you've got an API, and click on it. And then it's as simple as saying enable. Make sure you're selected the project you're working on in all these cases. So whatever your project is, make sure it's in the drop-down when you're doing these subsequent operations. So after you've enabled the API, this will show up, and you'll want to then create credentials for that. And you just sort of click through the steps. Here are the outlines from the tutorial. You'll get this form about what kind of credentials to create, and you'll want to do the application and just walk through some of the steps here about I'm using one or more. Okay. Then you'll need to go to configuring the consent screen, and it should pop up, and configure consent. Otherwise, you can search for create credentials, and you'll want to select external. After that, you're going to register your application, and you'll give it an application name, and then you put in your email. There's a few parts of the form I don't show here, which I'll show when I do the demo. Then you go to your dashboard. At the dashboard, you're going to start a new process now for creating a bucket that will be used. So you'll go to the cloud storage and create a bucket. Some of the elements that you want to do is enforce public access and fine-grained. So there's a few options there. Then the next step you'll want to do is go to create a cluster, and you'll find it under the Dataproc, under the hamburger menu up here. You look for Dataproc, and once you have Dataproc, then you'll create a cluster. You'll fill out some of the elements about creating the cluster, this type, and so forth. And I'm going to recommend essentially the defaults, and then some components that you'll want to add, a gateway, and also you want to add the Jupyter component. Then, as part of the configuration, you've got setting up the cluster and these different elements. And one of them is configure the nodes. And if you have lots of money, you put lots of nodes, but I just put a couple nodes. and each being relatively small. And finally, having done that, went ahead and select create. One of the elements, though, just before you do that is to make sure you reference your cloud storage. And this is important because you want to run your notebook and typically then save the results from that notebook execution. And if you connect a bucket, a cloud storage bucket, with your cluster, and that's what this does, then after the cluster is deleted, you still have the results, which can be saved to your bucket. Otherwise, you can still save it, but you have to remember to copy the data off of your cluster to somewhere else before you delete your cluster. So this makes everything a little bit easier if you make a cluster and then associate that bucket that you have, associate with your cluster. So that's an important step to do for persistence of your results. Once everything is up and connected, as I mentioned, and then you can go to a section of your cluster for web interfaces and work with the Jupyter portion of it. So here's a cluster. I click on it, and there's a web interfaces, and there at the bottom you also have a way to access it. You can do Jupyter Lab, but I'm just going to demonstrate Jupyter here. So there's some interfaces to your cluster. Once your cluster is up, you've opened your Jupyter notebook, it'll automatically create this subfolder called Notebooks in Jupyter. And if you've configured your bucket as mentioned, then it'll create these subfolders, these directories on your bucket. And then you can upload things to that portion of your bucket, and then they will appear in the Jupyter notebook. I'll show how all this works. Okay, so that's the upload. And here's how it works. Once you're looking at the Jupyter interface on the Dataproc, there's this GCS, and if you click through there, then these are this is the location which is associated with your buckets notebook Jupyter folder. So notebook Jupyter folder equals this GCS. So once you've uploaded your files to your bucket, then they appear within this interface, the Jupyter notebooks on the Dataproc cluster. Then you can open up one of your notebooks just by clicking on it. You can run it. One of the things you'll want to know, though, is, hey, if I want to run a notebook and reference the bucket to read data, what's the path? And so you go back to your bucket and you'll look on one of your buckets, wherever you're going to work. In this case, I've put my files under the Notebooks Jupyter folder, which was created when I opened the Jupyter notebooks in the Dataproc cluster. Then I want to have a path to this. You just click on it and it'll copy the path for you. And then I can use that path. Essentially, in this case, it's my demo, the name of my bucket, and then underneath that, the notebooks in Jupyter as the two subfolders, and then the data I've loaded in here. So when you read, it'll be GS for this Google bucket, and then the project, and then the path within that. Once that all runs, then you can go ahead and run a Jupyter notebook. I'm not a big fan of these notebooks that run on this Dataproc. Maybe a Zeppelin might be better, but in any case, here's some commands to select all the cells and run. Once you do that, then everything should run, we hope. All right, so that's a lot. So this goes on for a little bit. Let's see if we can make it happen. Here I am in my Google platform dashboard. I've already done this demo once when I created the slides. I just overviewed. I'm going to do it again. And so let's do it again. Let's hope this time it works. So I'm going to make a new project, and there's various ways to do it, but I'm going to select this drop down. And from the drop down, I'm going to do a new project. And all of this is free tier stuff. So here we go. So I'm going to make a project. I'm going to call it data demo. And maybe I'll put 01 This has to be unique across all projects, so we've got to make sure it's a unique name. I wouldn't put dashes or underbars or other things in it. Some things will not work. Next up, we have an opportunity to change the project ID. I'm going to click on Edit just to show you. Now mine seems to be relatively, consistent, but if you name it something sort of common, I don't know, let's do my project. That's probably going to be one that lots of people do. So we'll do my project. And then let's see, well, all right, so normally it'll have some random number here at the name of the project ID, and it can be confusing to work with, especially later on if you're going to connect it to Google Kubernetes Engine or something. So I like to specify my ID so it's something I can remember and easy to work with. Right, so there we go. I've got my name of my project. Let's go ahead and create the project. Okay, now I'm going to switch to my project, and it's a very important step. Okay, I'm going to switch to my project. Once I've switched to my project, now I can start working with that project. Everything is going to be in the context of this project. So one of the things I want to do next is enable my Cloud Dataproc API. So I'll type Dataproc API, and it should show up here. You can find these things in this hamburger menu at the left, but it's often easier just to type these things out into the search bar. So now I'm ready to enable it. So I'll click this. Remember, this is for my current project. So this is super important. All right, now I've selected enable. It's going to take a moment. After waiting for it to complete, it enabled the API. Now I'm going to go ahead and create my credentials by selecting that credential button. I'm going to select, as it recommends if you read through this application, data. I'm using more than one, and I'm done. Just created the credentials, and now I need to configure them. And I'm going to search for consent screen. You could also search for credentials. Seems like it used to show up, but so here we go. This is what I was searching for before, configure consent screen. So I'm going to select that, same thing as before. I'm going to select external, create. I'll give my app a name. Put in my email, which is required. Okay, I'm good. Now I'm ready to go ahead and create a bucket. So I've just got done creating an application, and I have credentials for it. Let's go ahead and create a bucket so we can use the bucket. You can always type at the top here, bucket or something like that. And you can use the hamburger menu and can scroll through and see the many things here. Once you've had it, then you can pin it, which I've pinned here. That's why I've got it's towards the top. I've pinned these items. So I've got my cloud storage here. And let's go ahead and create a bucket. Again, let's stick with relatively simple names. We're going to choose fine grain for how to control the objects. Everything else should be okay. Multi-region, standard. There's my bucket. I'm going to use that bucket. But let's go ahead next and create our cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my Dataproc cluster. And maybe if I had one, I would create a new one with this menu item, but it sees that I don't have any. So I've got this pop-up to create a cluster. So I'm going to do that. In this case, I don't want GKE. I'm just going to use the cluster on the compute engine. East, so I'm going to select this region. You can select whatever you want. I try to reduce the amount of resources used because this is free and I don't want to pay for it. I don't want them to, charge me for things. So if you have the lower usage, then they give you quite a bit of free of lower usage before they start charging you. So I'm going to do a standard, which is one node with n workers. And then I'm going to enable a gateway. And I'm going to also enable Jupyter Notebook. And if you wanted some of these other things, of course, you can enable them. All right, next on the left, I select some other things I might want to configure. In this case, they start off with 4 CPUs, and I don't need that just for the simple demo. So I'm trying to minimize my resources here. So I've got 2. I change it from 4 to 2. And you can change some of these other things, but mostly they're fine. Other customization of the cluster. The one that's important in this case is our bucket. We want to make sure that the bucket points to the one we just created so we can persist our data. There's my bucket that I'm going to use. I'm going to select it. Then further security options, which I'm going to leave for now. So really important that you associate a bucket with your cluster. Let's go ahead and create it now. This is going to take a little bit of time. Okay, after a few minutes, it finally completes, and I've got my cluster here, so I can click on my cluster and do some things with it. You can look at the interfaces, which I'm going to look at. You can actually see the virtual machines that were associated with this. You can see there's one master and 2 nodes. You could click on the master node, for example, and you could open a shell to it if you wanted to. So it's like a terminal that allows you to access the virtual computer. So you might want to install some things here, but you don't have permissions to do so. So as a rule, though, it allows you to look around and see what's going on with that, that remote computer. And let's go back, see what else we have. What we want to work with right now is our Jupyter Notebook. You can also look at the Yarn Resource Manager. Let's start off with the notebook. So right now, here's my notebook, and I went ahead and looked at this GCS, and there's nothing there. What I'm going to do now is open up my cloud storage bucket, and there should be a place there now. I've got my data demo, that's my bucket. And after I created the bucket, I started the Dataproc cluster. In the Dataproc cluster, created this notebooks folder and also the other metadata folder. Under the notebooks folder, there's a Jupyter folder, and underneath there, there's nothing. But now I can go ahead and click upload to upload the files I want to upload. So let's go ahead and do that. I had to look around. I got a couple files that I've uploaded now. One is the Jupyter notebook. It's a PySpark notebook, and also I've got some simple data. So now I can go back to my my cluster where I was working and look at this GCS. And last time I was here, it was empty, but you can see that I uploaded through the bucket, and now I have this these files here that I uploaded through the bucket. So after this cluster crashes or gets deleted, I'll still have this. And if I save out results to this bucket, then I'll have the results persisted. So that's an important thing. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this notebook now in Jupyter. And I grabbed this from the web somewhere, I forgot. But I'm going to go ahead and let's zoom in a little bit. And I want to read this data file. But the issue is, where's this bucket? So let me go find out where that bucket is. And here's the path that I'm going to get so I can use. I'm using this copy. And I'll move back to my notebook, and just so you can see exactly what's going on, I'll replace this bucket with the bucket path that I copied. So bucket path here, paste in a notebook, and hopefully it works. Okay, so you can see I got nothing going on. Let's go ahead and add a cell here. And I'm going to type Spark and just do return. So this Dataproc already creates a Spark variable, and it's set up sort of like Databricks in the sense that it's already got this going when I run my notebook. So now I can go ahead and run the notebook. And so you can do select all and shift return. And hopefully it'll run all the cells. Do I have a mistake? Let's see. Yeah, it's going. Okay. So hopefully this should read properly and then just go through, and it's a simple regression. It takes a little time, but looks like it works. Okay. That's a pretty straightforward. Now, of course, you could save files, and if you save files, then results, then they will go back to your bucket here. That's the important part of this. Okay, we got it to work. Now, a few other little things to consider. Let's go to our Dataproc cluster. And before all this is done, of course, I want to stop and delete it so that I don't get charged for it. But let's look at the cluster. I'm going to look at the web services or web interfaces. Another thing that you might want to look at is this Yarn Resource Manager. And I can look at the running jobs. And here's an application that's running, an application master. And you can see this is all running on the Hadoop technology, which, is a little bit different than if I was running on, say, Kubernetes engine. And I can look at this application master, which is your Spark UI. And for whatever reason, it doesn't always update. So I I'm not sure what's going on here, but I just wanted you to be aware of this so you can browse around and see the executors, for example. And it should have a couple executors. That's interesting, that one's dead, but a couple executors, one for each of the nodes. So I have the master and 2 nodes. Why this one is dead, that's sort of interesting. But okay, so that's my cluster, master and 2 nodes as specified. Okay, back to my notebook. You can also look at the Jupyter Lab interface if you want to. It's a bit more complete interface. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see it. And now I'm pretty much done. So let me go ahead and make sure I stop everything. So let's go to my hamburger menu and I'll look for my clusters, which is right there, but I just want to make sure that I know how to get there. I've got this cluster going. You can select it and select stop and then delete, or just delete. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this cluster. I don't want to be charged for it. And even though that's now going to be deleted, and it'll complete here in a moment, I can go ahead and, assuming I had some data that I wrote out, I can go to my bucket and then see the results. So this is an important point I want to emphasize, is that once you've run your cluster, then this persists around. This is my bucket. And I didn't put anything here, but I could have written out some results here. Okay, so that's about it. So I demonstrated how to create a Google Cloud Platform or GCP project. In this case, for the Dataproc, I enabled the appropriate APIs, which was the Dataproc API. We established credentials. We created a cloud storage bucket. And when we created our Dataproc cluster, we associated that cloud storage bucket with the Dataproc cluster, so that when we ran the notebooks, then any data we saved to that file system we could access later. We ran the notebook and I demonstrated a few ways to access things about the virtual image. Of course, you can find lots of information about the Google Cloud and accessing the virtual images and so forth, but this is just focused on running a Spark notebook in the Dataproc cluster. Hope it works for you.